Okay, so when you think of the word routines, you might be thinking of a routine that you perhaps do the night before an event, an occasion, maybe some training. But what we're going to be talking about in this episode is the moments leading up to a performance, an execution of a task or skill. So while routines the night before, the day before, maybe weeks before are really important for good performances and building confidence, competence in your skills, in how good you are at something. While that is all relevant, I'm going to focus on in the moment. So, pressure moments in particular, in which having a pre performance routine can really help. So, a pre performance routine, you might start to think of people such as Tiger Woods before he approaches a shot. You might see him looking at the hole that he's about to hit the ball on and visualizing the shot that he's going to take. He might start to get his grip sorted. He might then place his feet in a certain way before he even executes the shot. Those are the types of things that are a pre-performance routine. You might also think of someone like Michael Jordan, who would set his feet up in a certain stance. He would twizzle the ball. He would bounce the ball a certain amount of times. You might also think of people like Rafael Nadal, who has a very particular pre-serve routine that he acts and does before he serves every time. And so that is what we're going to be talking about, those routines that are before the moment in which they execute a task, especially in skills that are kind of closed off. So a serve is a good example. He's not having to hit that ball back. He is quite literally making that serve. So he just has to perform the skill again and again. Then a rally is a completely different thing. So hitting the ball back from an opponent, that's a completely different thing. But a penalty kick, a shot in golf, those types of skills where you can actually create a pre-performance routine, they're really helpful. So that's what today's going to be about. I also want to note that, and this is a trap that I got into as an athlete myself, is that I started to mix up the difference between superstitions and routines. I actually went throughout my career with some superstitions. I had these weird superstitions where I would wear a certain pair of socks, I would wear a certain shirt, and I had all these different superstitions. And I genuinely believed to myself that I would play better if I had all of those going on. And I have heard some wild superstitions in my time, not only in my sport, but in other sports. And maybe you have got some of those as well. But then as I started to get into the professional game, I started to form routines and pre-performance routines that definitely weren't superstitions. And then having now dived into performance psychology and having spoken to some professors and researchers, I have realized that the reason why superstitions are no good for us is because they're not in our control. If I look back at my superstitions with my socks and my shirt, none of that was in my control. What happens if my shirt gets lost in the wash? What happens if I lose a sock? I am now putting my performance at jeopardy or increasing my anxiety over a performance because of something that I cannot control. And if you've listened to this podcast or my work before, we want to have as many things in our control as we possibly can, because when we're trying to control something that we can't control but want to control it, we have higher anxiety. And the idea of a routine, the idea of having something that we can stick to, is to reduce our anxiety, is to reduce that feeling of stress, especially when we're under pressure. So if we have something that is not in our control and we're adding that in, that's something that is uncontrollable at some stage. And that could then at any moment create more anxiety, more stress. So I would like to start by making sure that we're not seeing these routines as being superstitions, because superstitions are not in our control most of the time. If it depends, you might be just renaming a routine a superstition, but have a look at your superstitions. Is it something that you're doing that may not be in your control? Maybe you have your favorite, like I said, piece of clothing that you're wearing. That could be nice, but can you actually play without it? And I'm sure you can. So again, the point of these routines is that they are 100% in our control. When you create a pre-performance routine, they are 100% in your control. So what is a pre-performance routine? It is essentially a routine or a sequence of task-relevant thoughts or actions in which an athlete engages in systematically prior to his or her performance in a specific skill. So, when we're thinking about, like I mentioned, routines that you could do the night before or weeks before, this is not what we're talking about. We're talking about a routine of thoughts or actions that you're taking before you engage in a task. So again, penalty kick, a serve, something where you're about to do a task, an action, and you engage in this routine. So in cricket, my sport, I used to have a routine before I bowled every ball. If I'm batting, I had a routine before every time I batted. So we might even talk about these as being a process. You could almost wrap these up as being a process, and that could be something that you name it as it is your process. And I will do, and I've spoken to guests on the show about processes, but I'll probably do an episode at some stage around a process and trusting your process, and that's a different conversation. But why do we need a routine? Why do we need a pre-performance routine? Ultimately, they help us improve our concentration. We actually have something that we are focused on that is relevant to us. More often than not, especially when you're under pressure, you're focusing on irrelevant tasks. So that could be distractions, it could be the crowd, it could be your own expectations or thoughts that are getting away from you that are irrelevant to you actually performing your task in front of you. So pre-performance routines are a sequence of actions and thoughts that we've spoken about that are relevant to what you're doing. And when you have something that's relevant to the task you're about to take and do, you can improve your concentration because you now have an aim. You have something to aim your thoughts at. You have something to aim your focus towards. So first off, concentration also helps with our skill execution. So actually being able to act out something, knowing that it gives us a positive outcome. So more often than not, your routine is built off actions that give you a positive outcome. And the more times we practice that, the more times we're going to improve our execution of skill. It'll also give us the ability to practice that execution. Once you've got this routine, you now have something that you can actually go and practice in practice. You have a routine that you just have to repeat. And especially if you know it gives you a positive outcome, you can start to repeat it over and over again. The other thing is consistency. So you will start to gain some consistency from being able to do a pre-routine. And that routine will allow you to stay consistent in your not only practice, but your performances as well, because you can hopefully just execute the same routine over and over again. If you don't have a routine, which I've been in before, you're essentially running in blind. You're creating a performance or you're trying to execute a skill, not really knowing what the things you're meant to be focusing on. So that knowing what you have to do and the tasks you have to perform, you can be consistent now because you know what to do and you just got to repeat it. And then actual consistency is another skill set in itself because you are trying to do that more and more, as well as being able to perform under pressure. So when we use pre-performance routines, we can actually perform better because we have something to focus on. As I mentioned, when you're under pressure, your attention gets pushed in many different directions, whether that's the crowd, thoughts, people, the opposition, whatever it might be. Your pre-performance routine will help you with focusing your attention under pressure. But again, linking back to practice, skill execution, concentration, once you start to practice under pressure and you add some elements of pressure in your training, that's where you can start to practice your pre-performance routine. So I'd even encourage people that once you start to put yourself under some really challenging situations in training, simply judge yourself on how well you were able to do your pre-performance routine. What parts of it maybe fell apart? What did you forget? What did you get lost on? Or what was challenging? What went really well? And that is where you can start to build out more confidence under pressure, especially if you're doing it in training. So yeah, they're great for performing under pressure. So how do we build a pre-performance routine? Now, I want to give you a pre-performance routine or perhaps you're in two camps. Perhaps you don't have one at all. You don't have an idea of what your pre-performance routine is, or you actually have one and you might need to develop it. So I'll address both of them. I'll obviously start with if you do not have a pre-performance routine? How do you start to build one? How do you start to build this pre-pressure moment routine, or this full pre-performance routine? I feel like I'm oversaying it. It's just very difficult to say. So the initial thought with this is you do want to make a pre-performance routine your own. You want to make this your own unique thing. It is yours. It's not someone else's. Having said that, if you don't have one, you may want to start to look for inspiration from someone that does have one. So it might be a role model. It could be someone that you admire in the team of yours, or just an athlete that you've seen doing one and you've heard of something. Try to take inspiration from other people if you don't know, or work with your coach. Your coach may have done one. Someone around you, a leader, may have already got one themselves, and you can start to gain inspiration from that. But if you do want to create your own unique one, what I encourage you to do first off is when you have a good performance or when you have a good training session, note down all of the things that you have been doing that went well. This could be technical parts to your game. This could be tactical. It could be the thoughts you were saying to yourself, or what someone was saying to yourself, and that resonated with you. Everything that was positively going on in that moment, write it down and see what resonates and what you think was a great attributor to getting that good performance. You may want to start to experiment with some different things. So you may want to experiment with ones that you think will work. And if that works for you, then great, go with that. You may also have something that you're working on as a skill, for example, and if you are developing your pre-performance routine, you might be working on one specific skill, and it could be just focusing on a very foundational part of that skill. So focus on making sure that you're not trying to overcomplicate this, and build your pre-performance routine through a few things that are foundational to that skill. And I'll get onto it in a bit, but your pre-performance routine will evolve. So even if you are taking a really early stage, basic, beginner process or action that you're going to focus on for this to begin with, to start that routine out, and like everything, focusing on the basics is really fundamental, and you just hear elite athletes talk about it all the time. Even if you are focusing on those fundamentals, like, don't discredit that. That is really important. That can be really, really helpful, because if you get that right, you've at least built a good, strong foundation. So if your pre-performance routine is built off a very foundational skill that you're focusing on, could be just something like watching the ball. It could be a very simple phrase that you're saying to yourself. Could be one thing that you're just focusing on in your skill, and that is it. That's fine. That's where we start. It hasn't got to be overly complicated. It hasn't got to be something really high level or really elite, or what we might think of elite. Sometimes the most basic things really do work. So don't worry about that. Focus on what feels good for you. Make sure that whatever you're doing does feel right. You're not trying to fit a square peg in a round hole, and it's not something that you're trying to manufacture without it really feeling good for you. Make sure that you're taking those technical cues, you're not overcomplicating them. You want to start with something that's really just simple to remember. And again, write it down. Once you've just started this process, start to write down. I remember putting things down in a diary for myself and building out a routine. And I remember I would do something on a Monday, I'd write it down, then I'd try to repeat it on a Tuesday. And then on that Tuesday, I might have added something new in, which really worked. So I'd changed the routine slightly. And then I was slowly building that routine for myself. You can also try a range of different skills or psychological skills. So it could be self-talk that really works for you. It could be imagery, like visualizing. It could be just taking a really deep breath. It could be something like taking a belly breath, just taking that deep breath, calming your system down. That could be enough for you to just have that pre-performance routine. I think of someone like Cristiano Ronaldo before he's about to take a free kick. He takes a big breath and that calms himself or focuses himself. That might just, I don't know, but that might just be his pre-performance routine, that big breath. And then he's actually executing a lot more underneath that. I'm sure there's layers to it, but that could be the first step, just taking a breath, building out that practice. If all of this and all of this practicing of it and finding it, your pre-performance routine doesn't work initially, and maybe it does end up not being good for you, don't panic. Don't panic straight away. it could be taking you some time to get used to it. You may also be trying to learn something that is obviously new to you. And we know with trying to learn something new, you're not going to get it right all the time. But don't panic if it's not the best straight away. That's okay. It will come over time. But obviously, like I said at the very beginning of this, you want to make sure you're getting some of the cues, the actions, the thoughts that you're saying to yourself and doing from when you've had good performances. So hopefully you can trust in the fact that there will be a good performance come out of it if you keep sticking to it. And you've got to trust that part of it. Because if you think it's just suddenly not working and you haven't seen success straight away, that could just be that day. That could just be what's going on right then. Trust that if you come back another day, repeat it, be really focused on it, maybe even just assess whether you were fully and honestly engaged in that process and in that routine. And if you were and it just didn't come off, that might have been that day. But maybe you didn't focus fully on it and you need to focus on it again the next day. And that's a part of the building of it, strengthening it and making it become a habit. I would also lastly add that this whole process is very flexible. As you can see from what I'm saying is there's a lot of trying out different things, but also it will adapt over time. You will change this. You will evolve as a player, as an athlete, as a person. Maybe even if you're a coach and you've got your own pre-performance routine, yours will change. There'll be parts where at the very beginning, if you're at beginner stage, it needs to be very instructional about what you're doing. You need to be very thoughtful in some of the actions that you're taking. Maybe, like I said, it's just one cue word or a phrase that you're saying yourself to remind you of how to execute a skill to the best of your ability. But the more you practice it and the more years you have of practice, that might become much more automatic and you might start to be a bit more motivational to yourself. You might start to use self-talk a little bit more, maybe visualization, maybe breathing is just the thing that you need. That deep breath, that deep belly breath might be the thing you need later down the line. But to begin with, it might not. It might need to be a little bit more focused on how to actually do the skill, how to execute the task, how to do it, how to perform. That could be exactly what you need. If it is an anxiety thing, if perhaps your issues are not based on how to execute the skill and it's purely anxiety, then yes, it could be these deep breaths, something to attack the anxiety and really deal with it and manage it and be braver. Again, I'm always talking about trying to be brave and courageous in face of anxiety. But again, all of this will change over time. So if you do have a pre-performance routine and you're just trying to develop it, you want to build it out, maybe it's stopped working, I think the piece of advice I would have for you here is to start having some awareness towards what is and isn't working. Look at what part of your routine perhaps is where you're having more anxiety, maybe more mistakes, maybe it's too complicated, maybe it's too difficult for you to remember. And so go back to some of it and try and simplify it. Sometimes we can overcomplicate these things and you might find that you're overthinking and your pre-performance routine has too much going on. Maybe you need to simplify it down. Maybe you need to add a little bit more in. But again, that could be about addressing it in training and actually playing around with that rather than thinking that I need to work on technique and whatever and just focus fully on how I execute my routine and what I'm doing in my routine. But that awareness could be the first step you need is just, okay, what is not working? What can I add in? What can I do next? And then again, it's practice. It's, am I practicing this routine under stressful conditions? Because when we need to use these, especially when we're under pressure, am I practicing being under pressure enough? Am I putting myself under pressure in training? And am I actually testing this all out when I get the chance to? Or am I just trying to do this when I feel good? Your opposition are not going to make you feel confident. So you want to practice in environments in training where you're not practicing with confidence. You're practicing where confidence is trying to knock you down. And how do you deal with that? How do you manage that? That's where we want to be braver, not less afraid of the situation. And that's where a routine is what we focus on. So can I execute my skill under pressure? And I need to do that in training so that when the moment hits me in a game, in a competition, and I'm under pressure, I've done this before. I know to focus on this, this, and this in my routine. I know what to do. Whereas if you haven't practiced it under pressure and that pressure hits you, that feeling is going to be far more intense than the remembering of your task. It's going to be very easy to forget that routine because you'll be so highly focused on everything else, all the distractions, everything around you. So I promise you to practice it under pressure. And that could be something that you're maybe missing is I'm not getting my routine right because when I get into pressure moments, it's falling apart. I'm not doing it. I'm not executing it. Are you doing it in training? Are you throwing in some pressure in training? That could be where you address it. And work on your routine with your coach. See if there's anything that they're seeing. Ask teammates, as well as doing that self-reflection for yourself. That could be the thing that helps you out. So hopefully there's something there for you to help build your pre-performance routine. Just some few final tips and just reminders is that your routine will take some time. It will take time to build this. It's not going to be like you write it down and suddenly it works. You might get some success straight away, but it's about consistency. It's about practice. It's about adding this in to your training. It will develop. Your routine will develop. And especially as you get better as an athlete, it's going to become much different. It's going to progress. It's going to be completely different from now to 5 years' time. I know mine was. But once you've got it, there will be a moment where you'll have some fundamentals. You'll have some core parts to your routine that you definitely will keep. And it's about building it. And what may feel complicated right now, down the line should feel a lot easier and consistent and will automatically happen. And you'll be able to focus on other parts of your routine that just to enhance it, to strengthen it even further. The routine is also individual for you. It's what works for you. So whenever someone is trying to tell you what works for them, as when I'm always trying to give some information, I hopefully and try to remind myself to let you guys know that this is what worked for me. It may not work for you. So again, when you're listening or having someone tell you what worked for them, take it with a pinch of salt because it may work for you. It may not. As well as when you're looking at someone else and trying to get some inspiration from others, it may work for you, it may not, but it doesn't mean you can't seek out that information and look to grow and develop yourself. Consistency is a very key part to this, making sure you are being consistent in your routine. So this again is not your routines the night before, week before, that will cover that maybe another time, but being consistent is a really important part of your routines. So being able to consistently perform this pre-performance routine will give you an indicator as to what's happening in your performance. Because if your performance is up and down and you're trying to fix that, but your routine is up and down, then you don't really know where the issues are. You want to make sure at least if your performance is your pre-performance routine is nailed on and you're doing that and you're executing that, then if there's an issue in the performance and the outcome, then there's at least something else you can be looking at and addressing. Whereas if you don't really know, if you haven't got this pre-performance routine, you don't know, then you're kind of wandering around in the dark a little bit. It's very hard to find out what the issues are in your performance and the outcome, especially if you're inconsistent in your routines. So be consistent, whether that's in training, whether that's in competition, for again, whether just to plan, execute, and review. As long as you're consistent in it, you'll find out where to get better, where to improve, where to develop, and much more. Make sure you also keep the routine really specific to the task. So don't really move away from what you're trying to achieve. There could be some extra bits that might help out. That could be, I think we're moving into the superstition realm where if we start to think about adding in bits that could support it. But you do want to make sure that your routine is really specific to what you're trying to achieve. Because again, if it's really detailed and focused and not too generalized, then that focus is magnified, or it's a much more detailed focus under pressure is going to be stretched or is going to be diluted when you're under that pressure. So if you're focused in on it and it's really tight focused and specific, you're not being too diluted in your thinking, and that leaves a less margin for error when you're under pressure. I think one of my pre-routines that I had before was about where I looked on the pitch to bowl, and I would say a certain area, and I would pick out a part of the stump that I would look at. And I remember this. It was like I'll look at this area, and actually, what I needed to do was to be really specific. So even if I was hitting like a Yorker, I would be like, I'm hitting this part of this shoelace, or I'm hitting this part of the pitch. And when I would get to a game, I would pick my section on the pitch and I would hone in and be like, that's the area I'm hitting. And it was really specific to the task that I was trying to achieve. Whereas if I was kind of just generalized, when the pressure got on, I just didn't have a very specific aim. I was like, oh, I think I'm going to aim at that area. And chances were the performance didn't come off. So yeah, be specific. And if you do find yourself deviating away from your routine, if you do find yourself going off task, just give yourself a moment to stop, reset, and go again. That's it. If you do find your mind wanders, don't beat yourself up. You're human. It's okay to have those mishaps and things like that. But just reset, take a breath, refocus on what is relevant, what you're trying to achieve, remember your routine, and then go back and execute it and just start again. And just repeat that. And there'll be moments where you fail and you will get it wrong. And that's actually a great part of the process. Failing in your routine is great because you will start to remind yourself what to focus on or where you perhaps have a chink in the armor of that routine. And you'll be able to continuously strengthen it by repairing those cracks, essentially. And then the more you do that, you'll have this library of mistakes where you've been able to deal with it in certain different scenarios. Again, this is why putting it under pressure is really important, because if you get distracted in a pressure situation, then you might know that it's a certain part of that pressure or certain thing that happens when you're under pressure that is where you deviate from your routine. And that's what you need to focus on, and a moment where you need to really hone in on it. And that failing of your routine is almost how you strengthen it. It pretty much is. So you can strengthen your routine through failing it. And you do that in practice. So don't beat yourself up if it does happen. It's not going to be perfect to begin with. That's the point. Embrace that imperfection, the process of actually building this routine. And once you've got one, it really does make a difference. I can vouch for that through experience, that once you've got that routine and pressure hits, you know what to do. And you listen to athletes that have had pressure moments and reporters get in their face and say, how did you do that? And they will say, well, I just executed my routines. I thought about what I had to do. And it's this that they're talking about. These tasks, these thoughts, these actions that they're talking about is what they are focusing on when they're under pressure. But it takes training to actually build it out, practice it, and then go and execute it. So that is everything for today's episode. I hope there's something there for you to take away. If you've learned something or something has really clicked for you, let me know. Get in touch, engage over on Instagram at Lewis Hatchett. You can drop me a message via email by heading to the website lewishatchett.com. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the podcast if you're listening on whether it's Spotify, Apple, whatever platform you're listening on. Do hit that subscribe button, that follow button. It makes a massive difference. And one more thing, if you are able to leave a rating or a review, that will literally make my day. It's you guys that are listening that can support in that way. That's totally free. It is the best and easiest way to support this show. And those of you that have done it, I really do appreciate it. It's so awesome to see how the show has helped you, or listen to you guys over on Instagram, sending in emails, whatever it might be. It really does make a difference. I can't stress it enough. So thank you so much for doing that. Let me know how you're getting on. If there's any topics that you want to listen to more of, I'm all ears, and I'd love to hear from you. So other than that, I hope this has helped, and I'll see you guys next time. Take it easy.